When I asked viewers where they'd like to see this channel go next, a lot of you had the same disposition. Some form of organizing or promoting collective effort to support men and improve their lives. Some said we need to organize, others said it's time to change laws, create new policy, even start a political party for men. All of them powerful ideas. The sentiment that if men mobilize like women did and do, then we could finally balance the scales. So let's break all of this down in this full deep dive series into men's organizing and mobilization to have their voices heard. For 60 years, every attempt to build a traditional men's movement, including rallies, organizations, lobbying, all of it, has all burned bright and then faded out. It's not that the effort wasn't noble. It's that the model has not fit for the collective group of men. Men don't mobilize the way women do, and expecting them to is like expecting a hammer to work like a screwdriver. Those are very different tools for very different jobs. Here in part one of this deep dive into men's organizing and mobilizing, we'll back up in history a little bit to look at how women built powerful, coordinated movements while men really never formed anything comparable, and why that silence still defines gender politics today. In part two, we'll break down the empathy gap. That's how society rewards female pain, punishes male vulnerability, and how the emotional economy decides who gets protected and who gets ignored. In part three, I'll dig into why men don't mobilize, even when they do agree that something's wrong, when they do have a common fight. It's the stigma, the conditioning, and the moral trap that keeps them from standing together. In part four, we'll follow the money and the power, how funding, media framing, and institutional bias built a one-sided system that calls women's advocacy progress and men's advocacy a threat. And I'll close it out with part five, in which we'll discuss where the real movement already is, how men are building change from the ground up through digital mentorship, shared education, and awareness that's spreading faster than any political movement ever could. That's why this deep dive exists. It's not to criticize men who have tried, but to understand why those old traditional methods have failed and why they keep failing. To see where the energy went, how empathy shaped one side of the gender divide, and how silence has shaped the other. Because before we can talk about how men win, we have to understand why organizing like women has never worked for them. Okay, so here in part one of this deep dive, we'll set up the foundation for the entire series. It'll trace how women's advocacy grew from marginal protests to institutional authority, while men's movements, on the other hand, never really developed comparable structures or legitimacy. This divide did not happen by accident. It evolved from differences in historical timing, cultural framing, and even emotional permission. Now, I realize that many of you will in fact have differing perspectives and causes for much of what I'm about to say, and that's okay. I'm not here to correct anyone, and I can't give an entire semester's worth of content in one series. My intent here is to help guys to at least understand a little bit of the root of this issue. The modern women's movement can be traced back to the mid-1800s, when early reformers like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. Their declaration of sentiments identified structural barriers such as voting exclusion, property restrictions, and legal dependency that kept women subordinate. Over the next 7 decades, organizations such as the National American Women Suffrage Association built networks of local chapters. They had newspapers and political liaisons that ultimately secured the 19th Amendment in 1920. Winning the vote for them was more than symbolic because it taught generations of women that coordinated advocacy could move law and culture simultaneously. That experience of organization, petition drives, coalition building, and national conventions, they became the template for everything that followed. After suffrage, activism didn't dissolve. In fact, it gained more momentum and it matured. During the 1960s and 1970s, second-wave feminism reframed inequality as systemic rather than interpersonal, while also targeting issues such as employment, education, and reproductive autonomy. Legislative achievements like the Equal Pay Act of 1963 and Title IX in 1972 expanded legal coverage, while women's studies programs in universities and newly formed commissions on the status of women embedded gender equity inside of the state itself. By this time, feminist leaders learned to convert protest into policy by occupying bureaucratic positions, producing data, and writing enforceable legislation. The result was institutional feminism that continues today, a movement that transcended street marches to become a permanent feature of government, academia, and nonprofit organizations. By contrast, men's advocacy never really followed a comparable trajectory. The so-called men's movement emerged in the early 1970s as, I would say, a loose reaction to feminism and social change. But it immediately fractured into two incompatible branches. One was pro-feminist men who supported gender equality and sought to redefine masculinity through emotional openness and anti-patriarchal ideals. The other was the men's rights or father's rights current, which we still see today, and is focused on perceived discrimination in family courts, education, and even domestic violence policy. Without a unifying moral narrative or institutional allies, these efforts have remained, I would say, peripheral. Men's rights organizations, such as the National Coalition for Men, have pursued legal challenges, for example, often self-funded and adversarial, but they very often lacked a broad coalition or cultural empathy that had powered and empowered earlier feminist success. Where women's movements built systems, men's movements have built case files. Feminism evolved into partnership with universities, philanthropy, and government. Men's advocacy grew as a counter-movement, without comparable legitimacy or funding. Cultural norms compounded this problem such that women's activism was celebrated as progress, while men's activism was interpreted as resistance and hostility. Even when men raised genuine equity issues, such as male domestic violence victims or paternal custody, they were forced into defensive framing, explaining why their suffering was valid before even being heard. This divergence explains why women's issues became systemic, while men's issues, by and large, have stayed reactive. Feminism institutionalized itself within the state, while men's groups remained external petitioners for the most part. Feminist scholarship gained academic departments and endowments. Men's studies appeared sporadically and was often viewed skeptically. And at this point in time, those are nearly non-existent. Over time, the imbalance solidified into what sociologists have termed gendered institutionalization. One side woven into policy machinery, the other left to volunteer associations and court filings. And a clear contrast emerges with practical examples. The Equal Rights Amendment campaign in the 1970s drew millions of supporters, major party endorsements, and sustained media coverage. Meanwhile, men's and fathers' rights organizations that were lobbying for shared custody or fairer alimony laws operated on shoestring budgets, often dismissed as fringe. Even when men's advocacy achieved partial victories, like the California court decision to extend domestic violence funding to male victims, it didn't translate into broader social infrastructure. No national agency for men's welfare ever followed, and no comparable funding network developed. The theme that closes this first part of the deep dive captures the asymmetry in one prevailing statement. The same century that taught women to unite taught men to stand alone. Women learned collective power through empathy and shared struggle, while men were socialized to handle adversity individually. That single cultural script, the lone, stoic problem solver, may be the quiet reason men's advocacy never really became a big movement at all. So that's how the divide began. One movement built on empathy, organization, and collective purpose, and the other silenced by pride, stigma, and isolation. Women learned early that compassion could be weaponized for change. Men learned that vulnerability could be punished. And that difference, who we're allowed to feel for, is what shaped everything that followed. So in part 2, we'll break down how empathy itself became gendered and why the world is trained to rush to women's pain but retreat from men, and how that emotional bias still controls which voices society chooses to hear.